The gardener was alone with a cake in the garden, but the lady of the house approached. Richard Johnson held the small cake with trembling hands, trying to light the candle for the third time, while the March wind insisted on blowing out the flame. It was his 52nd birthday, but no one knew. No one had ever known, actually. That's when he heard the soft footsteps on the trimmed grass. He quickly turned his face, hiding the cake behind his back with a clumsy movement that almost made him drop it. Catherine Williams stopped a few meters away, wearing that light beige dress she wore on spring afternoons, and looked at him with an expression he couldn't decipher immediately. "Richard?" she called, and there was something different in her voice. "What are you doing sitting there on the bench?" "I was just resting a bit, Mrs. Williams," he replied, but the tremor in his words gave him away. She took another step closer and then saw the half-hidden cake. Richard felt his face burn with shame. 15 years working at that mansion in Upper East Side, caring for every inch of the garden with absolute dedication, and now she found him like this, like a boy hiding something forbidden. "Is it your birthday?" Catherine asked, and there was a genuine softness in her question that caught him off guard. Richard just nodded, unable to form words. She continued approaching until she sat beside him on the wooden bench, so close that he could smell the delicate perfume she always wore. That simple gesture left him completely disconcerted. In 15 years, the lady of the house had never sat beside him like that. "May I see?" She reached out for the cake. He hesitated but ended up handing it over. It was a simple bakery cake, covered with white icing and a solitary candle in the center. Catherine examined it carefully, as if it was something precious. "You bought this for yourself?" It wasn't a question, it was a statement that carried weight. "It's just, there's no one else." The words came out before he could think to hold them back. "It's been so long since anyone remembered my birthday that I ended up forgetting to remember myself." Catherine stayed silent for a long moment, looking at the cake. Richard saw something pass through her eyes, a shadow of pain that he recognized because he saw it in his own reflection every morning. "Light the candle," she said softly. "I'll sing happy birthday to you." "You don't have to, Mrs. Williams. Light it," she repeated. But this time, there was a gentle firmness in her voice that didn't allow refusal. Richard obeyed, his hand still shaking as he struck the match. When the flame finally caught on the candle, Catherine began to sing. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but each word carried an emotion that made his eyes burn. When she finished, he closed his eyes and blew out the candle, making no wish because he had long stopped believing that wishes came true. "Thank you," was all he could say. Catherine didn't respond immediately. She remained sitting there beside him, looking at the garden he cared for so lovingly. The white roses near the fountain were particularly beautiful that time of year, and he saw them reflected in her eyes. "These roses," she finally spoke, "you always care for them with special attention. I notice that." Richard swallowed dryly. That observation surprised him. "They're beautiful," he replied, guarded. "They're more than that to you," Catherine insisted, turning to face him directly. "I see you talking to them sometimes when you think no one is looking." He felt his face burn again. In the past 15 years, he had grown accustomed to being invisible in that house. People didn't pay attention to the gardener, didn't notice his little habits or his moments of weakness, but apparently Catherine did. "My wife liked white roses," he confessed, surprised by his own honesty. "I plant a new one every year on the day she passed." Catherine nodded slowly, as if that information confirmed something she had already suspected. "How long has it been?" 23 years this month." The answer fell between them like a stone in a quiet lake, creating invisible waves. Catherine took a deep breath, and Richard realized she was also wrestling with some emotion. "My husband has been gone for 5 years, she shared, her voice almost a whisper. "And sometimes it feels like it was yesterday. Other times, it feels like it was in a completely different life." Richard looked at her with new eyes. All that time he had seen Catherine as the distant boss, the wealthy woman who lived in that huge mansion with her daughter. He had never stopped to think that she also carried her own sorrows. "I'm sorry," he said, and it was genuine, and it was. They sat in silence for a few more minutes, just existing in that shared space of grief and loneliness. It was Catherine who broke the silence first. "Let's cut this cake," she said, standing up. "Wait here. I'll get proper plates and cutlery." Before Richard could protest, she was already walking back to the house, her beige dress gently swaying with her steps. He stayed there alone, holding the cake and wondering what had just happened. That simple conversation had cracked something inside him, a wall he had carefully built over the years to protect himself. When Catherine returned, she brought not only plates and cutlery, but also a bottle of red wine and 2 glasses. Richard looked at her in surprise. "Birthdays deserve to be celebrated properly," she said, as if that explained everything. They ate the cake right there, on the garden bench, as the afternoon sun began to dip toward the horizon. The conversation flowed more naturally than Richard had experienced in years. Catherine talked about how the garden was her favorite place in the house, how she spent hours looking out the office window while he worked. Richard talked about the different seasons and how each plant had its own personality. "You really pay attention," he said at some point, genuinely surprised. "I always have," Catherine replied, and there was something in her eyes he couldn't interpret. "You take care of this place as if it was sacred, as if every leaf, every petal, carried an important memory." "It's because they do," Richard admitted. When she passed, I was completely lost. I didn't know who I was anymore, what my purpose was. It was by tending gardens that I found a way to keep going. Plants don't judge, they don't ask questions. They just grow if you give them what they need." Catherine nodded, delicately wiping a crumb from the corner of her mouth. "I understand that more than you might think," she said. "After Charles passed, this house became so quiet I almost went crazy. My daughter Julia has her own life, her own problems, and suddenly I found myself alone in a space that was too big, surrounded by memories that hurt too much to touch." "And what did you do?" Richard asked. "I learned to observe," Catherine replied, looking out at the garden. "I started paying attention to the small things, the way the light changes as the hours pass, the sound of the birds in the morning, your work." Richard felt something tighten in his chest. All those years he had assumed he was completely invisible to the people in that house. But Catherine was saying she observed him, that she noticed his work, his habits, his special care for the white roses. "May I ask a question?" Catherine hesitated. "You don't have to answer if you don't want to." "Go ahead." "The wedding ring you wear around your neck hanging from the chain," she pointed delicately to the chain visible at the collar of his work shirt. "Is it hers?" Richard instinctively brought his hand to his chest, touching the chain through the fabric of his shirt. "Yes," he confirmed. "I can't wear it on my finger. I tried for years after she passed, but it felt wrong somehow, as if I were lying to myself, pretending she was still here. So I started wearing it like this, close to my heart." Catherine nodded, and Richard saw tears forming in her eyes. She didn't try to hide them. "Charles had a special wedding ring," she shared. "It was white gold with an inscription inside that said forever. When he passed, I kept it in a box, along with other things of his. I can't look at those things without feeling like I'm going to fall apart. So the box stayed hidden at the back of the closet, where I don't have to see it every day. Everyone finds their own way to carry the pain," Richard said softly. "Yes," Catherine agreed, "but sometimes I wonder if I'm carrying it or just running from it." They fell silent again, but it was a comfortable silence, filled with the mutual understanding of two people who knew the deep pain of loss. The sun was lower now, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. "It's getting late," Catherine said, finally standing up. "Thank you for sharing your birthday with me, Richard. It's been a long time since I felt connected to someone like this." "Thank you, Mrs. Williams," Richard replied, also standing up. "You made this day special. I didn't expect that." Catherine smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her face in a way Richard rarely saw. "Perhaps we could have tea together someday," she suggested. "In the garden, of course. You could tell me more about the plants, about how to care for them." "It would be an honor," Richard said, and he realized he was smiling too. When Catherine went back inside the house, Richard stood there for a long moment, looking at the half-eaten cake and the two empty wine glasses. Something had changed that day, something subtle but meaningful. A barrier had been crossed, a bridge had been built between two worlds that normally didn't touch. He started to gather the things, but stopped when he saw something hanging from a branch of one of the rose bushes. It was a silk scarf, delicate and light beige, clearly Catherine's. She must have dropped it without noticing. Richard picked it up carefully, feeling the soft texture of the fabric between his calloused fingers. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. That night, Richard had trouble sleeping. He lived in a simple little room at the back of the property, a small but comfortable space that was part of his work agreement. Lying in the narrow bed, he stared at the ceiling, replaying the conversation with Catherine in his mind. There was something in the way she looked at him, in the way she chose her words, that left him unsettled. It wasn't exactly discomfort, but a feeling that something was beginning, something he wasn't sure he was ready to face. His wife, Martha, had passed when he was only 29. She was young too, full of life and plans. And then, overnight, she was gone. A complication during a medical procedure that should have been simple. Something so absurd and unfair that Richard had spent years unable to accept it. After that, he had completely closed himself off. He worked in various places, always quiet, always keeping his distance from everyone. That's how he ended up at the Williams mansion 15 years ago. Mr. Charles Williams hired him personally, appreciating his quiet dedication and his skill with plants. Richard remembered Charles well. He was a serious man, but fair. He treated the employees with respect, paid well, and rarely interfered with anyone's work. During the 10 years Richard worked for him, they developed a kind of mutual respect, although they rarely spoke beyond what was necessary. When Charles fell ill, the garden was one of the places where he spent most of his time in his last months. Richard remembered seeing him sitting on that same bench, looking at the white roses, with the expression of someone who was making peace with something important. "Richard," Charles had called him one day a few weeks before he passed, "may I ask a favor?" "Of course, Mr. Williams. When I'm no longer here, take good care of the garden. Take care of Catherine, too, as best you can. She will need this place." Richard had nodded, not fully understanding what that meant at the time, but now 5 years later, he was beginning to understand. The next morning, Richard woke with the first rays of sun. He had a well-established routine. Wake up at 5:30, make a simple coffee, and start working in the garden at 6 o'clock sharp. It was a routine that kept him focused, that gave structure to his days. But that morning, while watering the plants near the main house, he saw Catherine at the office window. She was looking at the garden, a cup of tea in her hands, with that thoughtful expression she had. When their eyes met, she nodded softly, and Richard returned the nod before going back to work. This became part of the new routine. Every morning, around 6:30, Catherine appeared at the office window with her cup of tea, and they exchanged silent nods. It was a small ritual, insignificant to any outside observer, but one that carried a special weight for both of them. A week after the anniversary, Catherine came down to the garden in the morning. She brought a teapot and 2 cups. "I thought we could have that tea we talked about," she said, with a shy smile that made her look younger. Richard wiped his hands on his work pants, suddenly aware of how dirty he must be. "I'm all covered in dirt, Mrs. Williams." "I don't mind that," she gently interrupted. "Come, sit with me." They sat on the bench, and Catherine poured tea into 2 porcelain cups that were too delicate for Richard's hands. He held them with extreme care, afraid of breaking them. "Can you teach me about the roses?" Catherine asked. "I've always wanted to understand better how to care for them." Richard began hesitantly, but soon found himself speaking more easily about something he loved. He explained about the different types of roses, how to prune them, the importance of soil and light. Catherine listened with genuine attention, asking smart questions that showed she was truly interested. "My mother had a rose garden when I was a child," Catherine shared at one point. "It was her pride and joy. She spent hours there, caring for every plant. I used to sit on the grass and watch her work." "You never learned from her?" "I never had the chance," Catherine replied, and there was sadness in her voice. She passed when I was only 12, and after that, my father sold the house, and we moved to an apartment in the city. We never had a garden again. Richard nodded, understanding that loss in a visceral way. That's why this garden is so important to you, he said. Perhaps, Catherine agreed. Or perhaps it's because it reminds me that there are still beautiful things in the world, even after so much loss. That morning meeting became a routine, too. 3 times a week, Catherine would come down to the garden with her tea, and they would spend half an hour or more talking. Sometimes about plants, sometimes about memories, sometimes about nothing in particular. Richard realized he was looking forward to those meetings, that he found himself looking at the house on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday mornings, hoping to see her appear. It was a strange and yet familiar feeling, something he hadn't felt in over 2 decades. But not everything was peaceful. Julia Williams, Catherine's daughter, was 28 years old and worked as a lawyer at a prestigious firm in downtown New York City. She visited her mother regularly, usually on Sundays, and Richard always made sure to keep his distance when she was around. One Saturday, Julia arrived earlier than usual. Richard was pruning the rose bushes when he heard raised voices coming from the house. He tried not to pay attention, but it was impossible not to hear. "Mom, I saw you with the gardener again." Julia's voice was loud, irritated. "People are talking." "What people, Julia?" Catherine replied, her voice calmer but firm. "Mrs. Harrington from next door called me. She said you've been having tea in the garden with him almost every week. And what's the problem with that?" "The problem? Mum, he's the employee. People will start talking. They'll think that—" "Think what, exactly?" Catherine interrupted. "That I'm keeping company with a kind man who has been tending our garden for 15 years. That I'm having a civilized conversation with someone who also lost a spouse and understands what I've been through. It's not appropriate, Mom. Dad wouldn't have liked this." There was a heavy silence, and Richard moved further away, not wanting to hear any more. His heart was beating fast, a mix of anger and shame burning in his chest. He knew those meetings with Catherine were innocent, but he also knew how people thought, how they judged. That evening, Catherine appeared at his little room. It was the first time she had gone there, and Richard was shocked to see her standing on the doorstep. "Mrs. Williams, No," she raised her hand, interrupting him. "I need to speak first. I heard Julia today. I know you probably heard too." Richard lowered his eyes, ashamed. "I don't want to cause any trouble for you. If you think it's better, we can stop with—" "We are not stopping anything," Catherine said firmly. "Richard, I am 63 years old. I've spent the last 5 years living in the shadow of grief, doing only what was expected of me, being the respectable widow everyone wanted me to be. Those conversations with you in the garden are the only times I feel alive again, and I am not giving that up because my daughter or the neighbors have opinions about what is or isn't appropriate." Richard looked at her, seeing the determination in her eyes but also the vulnerability. "People will talk," he said softly. "Let them talk," Catherine replied. "I've lost too much in life to care about gossip." But things started to get more complicated. Julia increased her visits, showing up unannounced, clearly trying to interrupt any moment Catherine and Richard might have together. And she wasn't alone in her disapproval. A few days later, Richard was working near the entrance when he overheard a conversation between Julia and someone on the phone. "Yes, I gave him a raise," Julia was saying, her voice full of irritation. "I thought maybe if he were more financially satisfied, he'd be less interested in befriending my mother. But it didn't work. They're still having those morning teas." Richard froze. He had received an unexpected raise the previous month and had assumed it was just recognition for his good work. But now he discovered it was something completely different, an attempt to what, bribe him, push him away? The anger and humiliation burned in his throat. He considered confronting Julia, considered leaving immediately. But then he thought of Catherine, how she had become important to him, how those morning meetings had brought light back into his life. That evening, he sought out Catherine. "I found out about the raise," he said directly. Catherine closed her eyes, looking tired. Julia had no right to do that without consulting me. I only found out afterward. Richard, I'm so sorry. She's having trouble accepting that I'm moving on. Moving on with the gardener, Richard said, unable to hide the bitterness in his voice. With a friend, Catherine corrected firmly. Richard, I haven't seen you as a gardener for a long time. I see you as someone who understands my pain, who makes me smile again, who reminds me that I'm still alive. But your daughter is right, Richard said. We're from different worlds. This will never work. Work, Catherine repeated, confused. Richard, we're friends, that's all. I'm not trying to make anything work other than having someone to talk to, someone who understands me. Richard realized his mistake and felt his face burn. Of course it was just friendship. What else could it be? He was the gardener. She was the employer. He lived in a small room in the back. She lived in a mansion. He wore clothes stained with dirt. She wore elegant dresses. I'm sorry, he said, embarrassed. I didn't mean to imply... You don't need to apologize, Catherine interrupted gently. But Richard, I need you to understand something. After Charles passed, I was so lost I thought I'd never be able to connect with anyone again. And then you shared your birthday with me, and I realized I wasn't alone in my pain. That meant a lot to me. It still means a lot. To me too, Richard admitted. Then don't let Julia or anyone else take that away from us, Catherine said. We're adults. We can decide who we want to spend our time with. Richard agreed, but deep in his mind a worry lingered. Julia wouldn't give up easily, and he feared things would get much worse before they got better, and he was right. A week later, Julia appeared in the garden while Richard was working. She wasn't alone. There was a man in a suit with her, holding a document folder. Richard Johnson? The man asked. Yes? I'm the Williams family lawyer. Julia asked me to review your employment contract. Richard felt his stomach tighten. Is there a problem? Actually, there's something interesting we discovered, the lawyer continued. Your contract was modified 5 years ago, shortly before Mr. Williams passed away. You have a lifetime stability clause. That means you can't be fired without just cause, and you maintain your job and housing as long as you choose to stay here. Richard looked at Julia, confused about why she was revealing this with such satisfaction. I didn't know that, he admitted. My father never mentioned it, Julia asked, and there was something sharp in her voice. No, he only said I'd always have a place here if I wanted. Interesting, Julia said, because this modification was made just 3 months before he died, and along with it, there was authorization for significant monthly payments to a specific institution, an orphanage in Philadelphia. Richard turned pale. That information caught him completely off guard. I don't know anything about that, he said. No? Julia crossed her arms. Then why would my father do something like that? Why guarantee your job forever and make payments to an orphanage? What connection do you have to all this? I have no connection, Richard answered, but his voice was trembling. Julia, I swear, I don't know what you're talking about. Is my mother involved in this? Julia asked. Does she know about the payments? I don't know. Richard was starting to lose his composure. Why don't you ask her? I already did, Julia said coldly, and she said she doesn't know anything, that my father never mentioned anything about it, which leads me to believe there are secrets in this house, secrets that involve you. Julia, that's ridiculous. Is it? She stepped closer to him. My father was a meticulous man. He didn't do anything without a reason. If he gave you lifetime job security and was sending money to an orphanage, there was a reason, and I'm going to find out what it is. Richard stood there, stunned, as Julia and the lawyer walked away. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of that information. Why had Charles done that? He truly knew nothing about payments to orphanages, and the lifetime job security. Why had Charles never mentioned it? That night, Catherine appeared again in his small room. She looked tired and worried. Julia told me about the contract, she said. Richard, did you really not know? No, I swear, he replied. Charles never mentioned anything beyond saying I would always have a place here. Catherine sighed deeply and sat in the only chair in the small room. Charles did many things without telling me, she admitted. In the last few months before he passed, he was very withdrawn. He spent hours in the office, going through documents, making calls. I thought it was just work, but now your daughter thinks I'm hiding something," Richard completed. "Julia is scared," Catherine said. "She lost her father 5 years ago, and now she sees her mother getting close to someone her father had mysterious connections with. She's trying to protect me, protect the family." "But she's wrong," Richard insisted. "Catherine, I know nothing about this. Do you believe me?" Catherine looked at him for a long moment and then nodded. "I do, but that means there's something here that none of us understands, and we need to find out what it is." In the following days, Catherine began investigating on her own. She spent hours in Charles's office, searching through old documents, trying to find some clue. Richard continued his work in the garden, but now everything had a shadow over it. The morning meetings with Catherine stopped, not because they wanted to, but because there was a tension in the air that made it difficult to maintain that normalcy. Julia continued her own investigations, hiring a private investigator to examine Richard's past. He knew he was being followed, that his life was being scrutinized. It was a horrible, invasive feeling that made him feel like a criminal, even though he knew he hadn't done anything wrong. It was Catherine who made the first important discovery. A week after the revelation about the contract, she called Richard to the main office. It was the first time he had entered that room, and he felt out of place among the expensive furniture and shelves full of books. "I found this," Catherine said, showing a yellowed envelope. "It was at the bottom of a locked drawer. I had to break the lock." Inside the envelope was a handwritten letter from Charles addressed to Catherine with instructions to only be opened in case of his passing. But Catherine had never received the letter, never knew it existed. With trembling hands, she began to read aloud. "My dear Catherine, if you're reading this, it means I've passed before having the chance to tell you everything in person. I know you must be confused about certain decisions I made, especially regarding Richard, but I need you to understand that I did what I did out of love for you and out of respect for someone who was very important in our lives, even if you never met this person. There is a secret I carried for many years, a secret that involves your family, your past. Richard is the key to understanding everything, but he himself doesn't know this. In the safe, there are documents that will explain everything. The combination is the date of our wedding. Please forgive me for not having the courage to tell you while I was alive. With all my eternal love, Charles." Catherine and Richard exchanged glances, both pale. What did that mean? How could Richard be the key to a secret about Catherine's family if they hadn't even known each other before he started working there? Catherine went to the safe built into the wall, hidden behind a painting. With trembling fingers, she entered the date of their wedding. The safe opened with a soft click. Inside were several documents, old photos, and another letter. Catherine picked up the letter first, but this time she didn't read it aloud. Her eyes scanned the words, and Richard saw her face lose all color. "Catherine," he called out, worried. She didn't answer, just kept reading. When she finished, her hands were shaking so much that the letter fell to the floor. Richard picked it up, hesitant, and began to read as well. The letter revealed something unimaginable. Catherine had a twin sister, a sister who was born with a special condition that, at the time, the family considered a reason for shame. The girl was institutionalized from a young age, and Catherine never knew of her existence. Her parents died keeping this secret. Charles had discovered it by accident years ago when he was handling Catherine's parents' inheritance. He found documents, birth certificates, payment records for the institution where the sister was, and instead of telling Catherine immediately, he decided to investigate first. That's how he met Martha, Catherine's twin sister. And that's how he met Richard, the young volunteer who cared for Martha with extraordinary dedication. Richard let the letter fall too, his legs weakening. Martha, his wife Martha, was Catherine's twin sister. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. "It can't be," Richard whispered. "Martha never mentioned..." She never said she had a sister. She probably didn't know, Catherine replied, her voice breaking. The letter says Martha was institutionalized so young that she had no memories from before. She grew up believing she was alone in the world. Richard sank into a chair, his mind struggling to process that impossible information. Martha, his Martha, was Catherine's twin sister. That meant that all that time, during all those 15 years working in that house, he had been near his late wife's sister without knowing. Why didn't Charles tell us? Richard finally managed to ask. Catherine took another sheet of paper from the safe, reading quickly. He wanted to tell, she said. Her voice choked. But the more time passed, the harder it became. And then Martha. Then she passed away. Charles thought it would be cruel to tell me about a sister I never knew and who was already gone. So he decided to do things differently. He hired you, gave you stability, and started making donations to institutions that care for people like Martha. It was his way of honoring her memory and, in some way, making up for the fact that Catherine's family abandoned her. Richard was crying now, silent tears streaming down his face. Everything made sense now. Charles's questions about Martha in the first weeks of work, the way he always treated him with special respect, the request he made before passing away for Richard to take care of Catherine. He knew, Richard said. Charles knew how much Martha meant to me, and he knew she was your sister-in-law, so he brought me close to you because you were the last remaining link to her, Catherine completed. You were the only person who truly knew my sister, who loved her, who made her happy, and Charles wanted me to have that connection, even if indirectly. They remained silent for a long time, processing everything. The garden outside remained beautiful and serene, oblivious to the emotional storm happening inside that house. The white roses, Catherine finally said. You plant a new one every year for Martha. All this time, without knowing, you were planting roses for my sister in the garden of the house where she should have grown up. Richard nodded, unable to speak. The irony and tragic beauty of that situation were too much to bear. Catherine approached him and, for the first time, truly touched him. She placed her hand on his shoulder, a gesture of comfort and connection. Tell me about her, Catherine asked softly. Tell me about my sister. I want to know everything. And so, on that quiet afternoon in Charles's office, Richard began to speak. He told her about how he met Martha, about her smile that lit up the entire room, about her kindness despite all the hardships she faced in life. He told her about how she loved flowers, especially white roses, and how they spent hours together just watching the sky. Catherine listened with tears streaming down her face, drinking in every word, every memory, every fragment of a sister she never had the chance to know. She had a heart-shaped birthmark on her left shoulder, Richard said at one point. Catherine gasped and pulled down the collar of her blouse, revealing her own left shoulder. There, in the exact same place, was an identical birthmark. We're twins, she whispered, touching the mark. She was my other half, and I never knew. Richard showed her a photo he always carried in his wallet. It was an old, faded picture of Martha smiling. Catherine looked at that image and saw her own face looking back, separated only by decades and circumstances. She looked like me, Catherine said, amazed. She was you, Richard replied, but with all the things life denied her, she never had the chance to have a family, a home, the life you had. But she was happy, Catherine. Within her limitations, she found happiness, and much of that happiness was because she knew she was loved. By you, Catherine said. Yes, I loved her with everything I had, and when she left, a part of me left with her. Catherine took his hand, squeezing it tightly. Now I understand, she said. Now I understand why I felt that instant connection with you on your birthday. It wasn't just empathy between two people who had suffered losses. It was something deeper. It was Martha, connecting us even after all this time. The revelation changed everything. Julia, when she was finally told, was shocked and, to her credit, deeply remorseful about how she had treated Richard. She cried upon hearing about the aunt she never knew, about how her father had kept that heavy secret for so many years. He was protecting all of us, Julia said, wiping away tears. Daddy knew that telling about Martha would be painful for my mother, but not telling was also painful, so he found a way to honor her without causing pain. And Richard, I'm sorry for everything I said, for how I treated you. Richard accepted the apology, but he himself was dealing with a mountain of emotions. For 15 years he had worked in that house, tended that garden, without knowing he was walking the same grounds that should have belonged to his wife. But there were more secrets to be uncovered. Among the documents in the safe, Catherine found something disturbing. There were records of Charles's attempts to bring Martha to live with them years ago, but he had been blocked by legal issues and her own health condition. He wanted to bring her home, Catherine read aloud from a journal Charles had kept. He wanted me to meet my sister, but the doctors said she was too fragile for such a big move, and then, before he could try again, she passed away. There were also letters that Charles had written but never sent, addressed to Catherine, trying to find the right words to tell the truth. In one of them he wrote, "How do I tell the woman I love that she has a twin sister who was hidden by the family? How do I admit that I found out years ago and didn't say anything? Each day that passes it gets harder. And now after Martha's gone it seems too cruel. Catherine has already lost so much. How can I add this pain?" Richard and Catherine spent weeks immersed in those documents, piecing together a story that had been deliberately hidden. They discovered that Catherine's parents had the twins at a time when having a daughter with special needs was considered a social scandal. Pressured by society and their own shame, they made the devastating decision to institutionalize Martha while raising Catherine as an only child. "They stole a sister from me," Catherine said with anger and sadness, "and they stole a family, a normal life from Martha. How could they do that?" "They were different times," Richard said gently, though he too felt angry. "It doesn't excuse what they did, but people thought differently about those things." "Martha deserved better," Catherine insisted. "Yes, she did," Richard agreed. "But she had love, Catherine. She had people who cared for her at the institution, and she had me. It wasn't the life she should have had, but it wasn't a wasted or meaningless life." Catherine found comfort in those words, but the anger and sadness for her lost sister still burned in her chest. She began visiting the institution where Martha had lived, talking to the people who knew her, gathering every memory, every story. One of the caregivers, now elderly, remembered Martha well. "She was a ray of sunshine," the woman said with a nostalgic smile. "Even with all her difficulties, she always had a smile to give, and when her Richard showed up, oh, you should have seen how she lit up. She loved him so much." Catherine soaked up these stories like water in the desert. Every piece of information about Martha, every shared memory, helped fill the void of a whole lifetime without knowing she had a sister. Richard accompanied her on these visits, and together they began putting together a memory album of Martha, photos the institution had kept, drawings she had made, letters she had dictated for the caregivers to write to Richard. One of those letters made them both cry. Martha had dictated to the caregiver, "My dear Richard, today I saw a bird in the garden and thought of you. It sang so beautifully, as if telling me that good things still happen in the world. You are my good thing. You make me remember that I matter, that my life has value. Even when it's hard, when my body doesn't cooperate and my head gets confused, I think of you and find strength. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for making me feel complete. With all my love, Martha." She knew she was loved, Catherine said through tears. That's what matters. In the end, she knew. "Yes," Richard replied, his voice choked. She knew. The discovery of that family secret also brought unexpected consequences. Catherine began rethinking her own life, her own choices. She realized she had spent so much time being the perfect daughter, the perfect wife, the perfect mother, that she had forgotten to simply be herself. "Martha never had the chance to make choices," she told Richard one day, while having tea in the garden. "But I did. And I wasted many of them trying to please people who are already gone, trying to live up to expectations that weren't even mine." "It's never too late to change," Richard replied. "Isn't it?" Catherine looked at him. "I'm 63 years old, Richard. My life is more behind me than ahead of me." Your sister would have said that every day is a new chance. Richard spoke with conviction. She always said that. No matter what happened yesterday, today is a fresh start. Catherine smiled through her tears. I wish so much I had known her. In a way, you know her now, Richard said. Through all these stories, all these memories, Martha is alive in both of us, in the memories we carry. They sat in silence for a while, watching the white roses gently sway in the breeze. The garden had never seemed so meaningful as it did at that moment. But there was one more twist waiting for them. A few weeks later, the lawyer Julia had hired appeared with new information. He had investigated the orphanage where Charles was sending monthly payments and discovered something surprising. The payments weren't general donations, the lawyer explained. They were specific to one particular child, a girl named Emma Clare, who was left at the orphanage 22 years ago. Catherine and Richard looked at each other, confused. Who is Emma Clare? Catherine asked. That's the interesting part, the lawyer continued. There are no records of the parents. The child was left with just a note saying she was the daughter of someone who couldn't take care of her, and your Charles started making payments for her upbringing and education shortly after she arrived at the orphanage. Did Charles have a child out of wedlock? Julia asked, horrified. No, the lawyer shook his head. I did DNA tests with material I obtained from your father's office. Emma Clare is not biologically related to him. Then why was he paying for her upbringing? Catherine was growing more confused. The lawyer hesitated before answering. Because she is Martha's daughter, he finally said, and Richard's. The silence that followed was absolute. Richard turned white as a sheet, his hands gripping the arms of the chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white too. That's impossible, he finally managed to say. Martha and she was never pregnant. I would have known. The pregnancy happened shortly after you got married, the lawyer explained, consulting his documents. According to the medical records I found, Martha was told that due to her condition, a pregnancy would be extremely risky. The doctors recommended terminating. But she refused. She kept the pregnancy hidden as long as she could, wearing loose clothes, staying in her room more. The institution eventually found out, of course, and when it was time to give birth, they took her to a hospital. But why didn't anyone tell me? Richard was standing now, his voice rising. I had the right to know. She was my daughter. The institution's doctors made the decision, the lawyer said calmly. They thought it would be for the best for everyone. Martha was very weak after the delivery, and they feared the news might complicate things. Complicate? Richard laughed bitterly. They stole my daughter from me. They stole Martha's chance to be a mother. Catherine was in tears, clutching Julia's hand. Charles knew about this all along, she whispered. That's why he started the payments. He knew Martha had a daughter, and that this daughter was my niece. He was taking care of our family the best way he could. Where is she now? Richard asked, his voice trembling. Where is Emma Clare? She was adopted when she was 5, the lawyer answered, by a family in Boston. Charles's payments continued, but indirectly, through a trust fund for her education. She knows nothing about her biological origins. I have a daughter, Richard said, more to himself than to the others. I have a daughter, 22 years. She's 22 years old. Julia stood up and placed a hand on Richard's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that surprised everyone. Let's find her, she said with determination. Dad kept records of everything. There must be information about the family that adopted her, about where she is now. The following weeks were a frantic race of investigation. Catherine, Julia, and Richard worked together, using all available resources to track down Emma Clare. They discovered she had recently graduated in education and worked as a teacher at a public school in Boston. Her adoptive family was modest but loving, and from the accounts they gathered, she was a kind and dedicated young woman. She looks like Martha, Catherine said, looking at a photo they managed to obtain through social media. The same eyes, the same smile. Richard looked at the photo and felt his heart tighten. That was his daughter, the daughter he never knew he had. The daughter Martha had given birth to alone, probably scared and suffering, and whom he never had the chance to hold. What do I do? He asked, his voice broken. How do I show up in her life after 22 years and say, "Hi, I'm your father you never knew existed." "You don't do that," Catherine said softly. "Not yet. First, we need to find out what she knows, what she was told about her origins, and then, if she wants to know more, if she's ready, you can introduce yourself. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Julia took the lead of the operation, using her contacts as a lawyer to make discreet approaches. She found out that Emma Claire knew she was adopted, but knew nothing about her biological parents beyond the fact that her mother had passed away shortly after her birth. "She believes she was abandoned," Julia reported after a conversation with one of Emma Claire's co-workers. "She grew up thinking her mother didn't want her, that she was left behind because she was a burden." Richard closed his eyes, the pain of that revelation cutting deep. Martha had loved that child enough to risk her own life to bring her into the world. She hadn't abandoned Emma Claire. She had been stolen from her. "We need to tell her the truth," he said with conviction. "She deserves to know she was loved from the start, even if she never had the chance to meet her mother." Catherine agreed, but suggested caution. "Let's do this the right way," she said. "Let's gather everything we know about Martha, all the letters, photos, memories, and then we'll go to her with the complete truth, not just fragments." It took 3 more weeks to put everything together. They created a complete album of Martha's life, from her childhood in the institution to her final days. They included the letters she had dictated, the drawings she made, photos of her happy moments, and at the center of it all, they placed the love story between Martha and Richard and the sacrifice she made to bring Emma Claire into the world. When they finally felt ready, Julia made the first official contact. She wrote a careful letter to Emma Claire, explaining that there was information about her biological mother she might like to know. She didn't mention Richard yet. She didn't want to overwhelm the young woman with too much information at once. Emma Claire's reply came 2 weeks later. It was a handwritten letter, nervous and hopeful, saying yes, she would very much like to know more about her mother. The meeting was set for a Saturday in June, in the garden of the Williams mansion. Catherine thought it was appropriate that it happened there, among the white roses that Richard planted in memory of Martha. It was as if they were closing a circle that had begun decades ago. Richard was more nervous than he had ever been in his life. He changed his clothes 3 times, unable to decide what would be appropriate to meet the daughter he never knew he had. In the end, Catherine helped him choose a simple shirt and clean pants, nothing too formal but respectful. When Emma Claire arrived, Richard saw her from the window of his small room. She was petite, delicate, with long brown hair and an uncertainty in her movements that broke his heart. Catherine greeted her first, leading her to the garden, offering tea, creating a comfortable atmosphere. "Where is my father?" Emma Claire finally asked, after Catherine had shown some photos of Martha. "I know about my mother now, but what about my father? The letter didn't mention anything about him." "He is here," Catherine replied softly. "In fact, he has always been here. He just didn't know about you, just as you didn't know about him." Emma Claire looked confused. "What do you mean he didn't know?" It was at that moment that Richard came out of the small room and began walking toward the garden. Each step felt heavier than the last, his heart beating so loudly he was sure everyone could hear it. When he reached the garden, he stopped a few feet from Emma Claire. Their eyes met, and there was a moment of silent recognition. She had Martha's eyes, but the shape of his face. She had her hair, but his height. She was a perfect blend of the two, a living proof of the love they had shared. "I am Richard," he said, his voice nearly breaking. "I was married to your mother, Martha." Emma Claire stood up slowly, her eyes wide. You are my father." Richard just nodded, unable to trust his voice. Tears were already streaming down his face. "But how? Why didn't anyone tell me?" Catherine gently intervened, beginning to explain the whole story, about how the pregnancy was kept a secret, about how decisions were made without Richard's knowledge, about how Charles had discovered everything and started taking care of Emma Claire from a distance. Emma Claire listened with tears running down her face, her hands trembling as she held the album Catherine had prepared. "Did my mother want me?" she finally asked, her voice small and vulnerable. "Even knowing she was sick, that it was dangerous, did she want me?" "She loved you from the moment she knew you existed," Richard said, finally finding his voice. "She loved you so much that she gave her life to give you a chance to live. It wasn't abandonment, Emma Claire. It was the greatest act of love she could give." Emma Claire broke down in tears, and Richard, after 22 years of not knowing he had a daughter, finally hugged her. She clung to him as if she were drowning and he were a life preserver, and Richard cried as he hadn't cried since Martha had passed away. Catherine and Julia watched with their own tears, witnessing that unlikely reunion, that family being put back together piece by piece. "I planted roses for her," Richard said between sobs. "Every year, on the day she passed, I plant a white rose. Those there," he pointed to the special flower bed, "they're all for your mother, 23 roses, one for each year without her." Emma Claire looked at the roses through her tears. "She loved white roses," she whispered. "I've always loved them too without ever knowing why. It's like some part of me remembered her." "Maybe it does," Catherine said softly. "You were together for 9 months. Maybe some part of her love stayed with you." The days that followed were intense and emotional. Emma Claire started visiting frequently, wanting to know everything about Martha, about Richard, about the story that had been hidden from her for so long. She met Catherine, her biological aunt, and Julia, her cousin. She saw the mansion where her mother should have grown up, the garden that Richard tended with so much love. "I can't believe you were always here," Emma Claire told Richard one day as they walked together through the garden. "All these years, you were taking care of this place, planting roses for my mother, not knowing I existed." "If I had known," Richard began, but she interrupted him. I know you would have looked for me if you had known, but maybe it happened this way for a reason. I had loving parents, a happy childhood, and now I have you too. I have a biological family that wants me." "We always wanted you," Richard said firmly. "Your mother wanted you from the very beginning, and if I had known, I would have moved heaven and earth to be with you." Emma Claire took his hand, a simple gesture that meant more than 1,000 words. Emma Claire's integration into the family brought new life to the mansion. Catherine, who had spent the last 5 years alone in that huge space, suddenly found herself surrounded by family. Julia, who had been an only child her whole life, now had a first cousin to share with. And Richard, who had lived in solitude for 2 decades, finally had his daughter. But not everything was easy. Emma Claire struggled with complex feelings about her adoptive parents, fearing they would feel betrayed by her wanting to know her biological family. Richard assured her that love wasn't something limited, that she could love both families without diminishing either. "Your adoptive parents raised you, loved you, made you who you are," he said. "I'm grateful to them for that. I'm not trying to replace them. I just want to be part of your life in whatever way you allow." Emma Claire eventually introduced Richard to her adoptive parents, a nervous but necessary meeting. To everyone's relief, they were understanding and supportive, grateful to finally know the full story of the daughter they had loved as their own. As the months passed, other truths began to emerge. Catherine discovered more letters from Charles, explaining his motivations, his fears, his hopes. In one of them he wrote, "I know that by keeping this secret, I'm potentially causing more pain in the future, but I also know that the truth now would be devastating for everyone involved. Richard is building a new life here, trying to heal from losing Martha. Catherine is processing the death of her parents and finding out about a sister she never knew would be too much. And Emma Claire, that girl deserves a normal childhood, without the burden of knowing her mother gave birth to her knowing it could cost her life. So I carry this weight alone, and I pray that when the truth finally comes out it will be at the right time, when everyone is ready to deal with it." "He loved this family so much," Catherine said, caressing the letter. "He carried this burden alone for years, trying to protect all of us. And in the end he succeeded," Julia added. "It might not have been the way he planned, but it brought us all together." Richard agreed silently. Charles Williams, a man he barely knew, had completely changed his life. He had given him a home, had cared for his unknown daughter, had created the circumstances for the truth to eventually come out in the least painful way possible. There were also practical matters to resolve. The lawyer informed them that the trust fund Charles had established for Emma Clare had a substantial amount left, originally intended to cover her education until she completed a master's or doctoral degree. "I don't know if I can accept this," Emma Clare said when she was told. "I barely knew Mr. Williams." "Why would he do so much for me?" "Because you were the niece of the woman he loved," Catherine explained. "And because you were the daughter of the man who loved your sister. To Charles you were family, even if you didn't know it, and he took care of his family." Emma Clare eventually accepted, using part of the money to open a small school for children with special needs in Boston. It was her way of honoring the memory of the mother she never knew, continuing the work of caring for people like Martha. "Your mother would be so proud," Richard said at the school's opening, his tears of joy mixed with the perpetual sadness that Martha wasn't there to see it. The school was named Martha's Place, and Richard planted white roses throughout the front garden. It was a perfect circle. The roses he planted in memory of Martha would now bloom in a place dedicated to helping children like she had been. But there were still more surprises in store. While organizing Charles's office, Catherine found one last hidden envelope, this one addressed to Richard. Inside was a letter that Charles had written shortly before passing. "Richard, if you're reading this, it means Catherine has finally uncovered all the secrets I kept. I know it must be confusing, perhaps even painful, to understand why I did things the way I did. But I want you to know that every decision was made with care and love. When I found out about Emma Clare, my first reaction was to tell you immediately. You had the right to know you had a daughter, but then I thought about the consequences. You were finally finding peace, building a new life. Finding out about Emma Clare at that time, when she had already been adopted and there was no real possibility of getting her back, would have destroyed you. So I waited. I continued to care for her from a distance, making sure she would have every opportunity in life. And I planned so that, when the time was right, the truth could be revealed in a way that would allow you to reunite. Not as father and baby, but as father and adult daughter, capable of building a real relationship. I hope you can forgive me for making these decisions without your permission. They were made with love, even if imperfect. Take care of my Catherine. Take care of your Emma Clare. And know that wherever I am at peace knowing I did the best I could for my family. With respect and friendship, Charles." Richard read the letter several times, each word being absorbed. He felt anger, yes, for having been kept in the dark for so long. But he also felt deep gratitude. Charles had, in his complicated way, taken care of all of them. He had created a situation where eventually the truth could emerge without destroying anyone. "I forgive him," Richard said to Catherine, folding the letter carefully. "How can I not forgive? He gave me a home when I needed it most. He took care of my daughter when I didn't know she existed. And in the end, he orchestrated everything so that we could all find each other." Catherine hugged Richard, a long, comforting embrace between two people who had been through so much together. "We are family now," she said. "Not in the traditional sense, but family all the same. United by Martha, by Charles, by Emma Clare." "Yes," Richard agreed. "A strange and complicated family, but ours." The months turned into a year. The dynamics of the mansion had completely changed. Richard still tended the garden, but now he was no longer just the quiet gardener. He was an integral part of the family, participating in dinners, celebrations, important decisions. Emma Clare visited often, bringing with her the light and joy she had inherited from Martha. She and Julia became close, discovering they had much in common despite their different origins. And she and Richard Johnson carefully built a father-daughter relationship, learning about each other, discovering similarities and differences, creating new memories. Catherine, in turn, flourished in a way no one expected. At 64 years old, she was more vibrant and alive than she had been in decades. She began to actively involve herself in the school that Emma Clare had founded, offering financial and practical support. She learned about roses with Richard, getting her elegant hands dirty in the soil for the first time in her life. and she learned to honor the memory of the sister she never knew, finding peace in the fact that, through Emma Clare, a part of Martha continued to live. "Sometimes I look at Emma Clare and see Martha," Catherine confessed to Richard one day. "It's almost as if she gave me a final gift, gave me the chance to know her through her daughter." "Martha would have loved to meet you," Richard replied. "She always felt something was missing, that there was a void in her life she couldn't explain. Now I know it was you. She was missing the twin sister she never had the chance to meet." There were difficult times too. Emma Clare had some emotional breakdowns, processing the magnitude of everything she had discovered. She struggled with feelings of anger about how her mother was treated, how she was institutionalized and forgotten by the family. Richard helped her in these moments, sharing his own struggles with anger and acceptance. "We can't change the past," he told her during one of these times. "We can't undo the wrong decisions other people made. But we can choose how we move forward. We can choose to honor your mother's memory by living well, loving well, making a difference in the world." Emma Clare eventually found peace, helped by the support of her biological and adoptive families. She began writing about her experiences, sharing her story in blogs and small articles. Her story resonated with many people who had been adopted or had loved ones with special needs. It was during one of these writing periods that Emma Clare asked a question that changed everything again. "Where is Martha buried?" she asked Richard. "I want to visit her." Richard was quiet for a long moment before answering. "She was cremated," he finally said. "And her ashes are in the garden." Emma Clare and Catherine looked at him in surprise. "In the garden?" "Under the white roses," Richard explained, his voice choked. "Every year, when I plant a new rose for her, I mix some of her ashes with the soil. It was her wish. She told me before she passed that she wanted to become part of something beautiful, that she wanted to keep growing and blooming even after she was gone." There was a deep silence as this information settled. The white roses that had become a symbol of memory and love literally contained Martha. She was there in the garden, growing and blooming every spring. "All this time," Catherine whispered, "my sister has been here, right here, in this garden." "Yes," Richard confirmed, "and now that you know, I hope you don't feel strange about it." "Strange?" Emma Clare shook her head, tears streaming. "It's perfect. It's exactly what she deserved. Not a cold grave in a cemetery, but here, in this beautiful place, becoming part of the flowers she loved." They spent the afternoon sitting in the garden near the white roses, each quiet with their own thoughts. It was as if Martha were there with them, her presence felt in every petal, every sweet fragrance, every breath of wind that moved the leaves. "I want to help plant the next rose," Emma Clare said. When the day comes." "Me too," Catherine added. "If Richard allows." Richard looked at the two women Martha had left behind, his daughter and his sister, and felt something tighten in his chest. "Martha would have loved this," he said. "She always wanted a big family, and now, in a way, she has one." When the anniversary of Martha's passing arrived, it wasn't just Richard who planted the 24th white rose. Catherine, Julia, and Emma Clare were there too. Together they dug the hole, mixed the soil with the last ashes of Martha that Richard had saved, and planted a particularly beautiful rose that Richard had chosen weeks before. "For Martha," Catherine said, her voice solemn, "the sister I never knew but always loved from the moment I learned she existed. For Mother," Emma Clare added, "who gave me life even knowing the cost. I promise to honor your sacrifice every day." "For Martha," Julia said, though she had never met her. The aunt who connected this family in unexpected ways. "For my Martha," Richard finished, his voice breaking. "Love of my life, mother of my daughter, the woman who taught me that true love is sacrifice and courage. I love you always." They watered the new rose together, and then stood there in silence, hands intertwined, an unlikely family united by love and loss. The years that followed brought more changes, all positive. Emma Clare's school grew, becoming a reference in caring for children with special needs. Richard became a volunteer consultant, using his gardening knowledge to create therapeutic green spaces in various institutions. Catherine transformed part of the mansion into a support center for families dealing with issues similar to those Martha had faced. She became a vocal advocate for changes in care and integration policies, using her social position and resources to make a real difference. Julia, inspired by her family's story, shifted the focus of her legal practice to family law and adoption, helping reunite families and ensuring children like Emma Clare wouldn't get lost in the system. On a warm summer afternoon, 5 years after that first anniversary in the garden when Catherine found Richard crying alone, they sat together on the same bench. The garden was more beautiful than ever, the 29 white roses blooming magnificently. "Have you ever thought about what would have happened if I hadn't seen you that day?" Catherine asked. "I think about it sometimes," Richard admitted. "We'd probably still be living separate lives, both alone, both carrying our pain in silence." "Charles knew," Catherine said with conviction. "He must have known we would eventually find each other, that you needed me as much as I needed you." "Perhaps," Richard agreed. "Or maybe it was just fate. Martha bringing us together even after she was gone." They sat in comfortable silence, watching Emma Clare play with her children on the lawn. She had married the previous year, a beautiful ceremony in the very garden among Martha's roses. Her 2 young children, 2-year-old twins, ran freely across the grass, their laughter filling the air. "Martha has grandchildren," Catherine observed with a smile. "She would be a grandmother." "She would be the best grandmother," Richard said, his voice full of emotion. "And you're great in the role, by the way." Catherine laughed. "Great aunt, technically. But yes, I love those boys as if they were my grandchildren." "Family isn't always about blood," Richard said. "Sometimes it's about who we choose to love, who we choose to keep close." "Deep for a gardener," Catherine teased gently. "Learned from the best," Richard replied with a smile. One of the twins, Peter, ran up to them, his cheeks red from playing. "Grandpa Richard! Grandma Catherine!" he called, using the titles he had created for them. "Mommy said there's cake." "Oh, did she?" Richard lifted the boy into his arms. "And you already ate it all?" Peter laughed, that pure and uncomplicated laugh of childhood. "No, Mom saved some for you." They walked back to the house together, Peter in Richard's arms, Catherine beside them. Emma Clare waited for them on the porch, a simple chocolate cake in her hands, candles already lit. "Dad," she called, "this year you won't be alone on your birthday." Richard felt tears sting his eyes. 57 years, and finally he had a family to celebrate with him. They sang Happy Birthday, the whole family gathered, their voices blending in imperfect but beautiful harmony. When Richard blew out the candles, he made a silent wish, that wherever Martha was she could see this, could see the family that had grown from her love and sacrifice, and perhaps she could. Perhaps in the petals of the white roses, in the laughter of the grandchildren she would never know, in the love that united those unlikely people, a piece of Martha still lived. That night, after everyone had left or retired to their rooms, Richard was alone in the garden once more. But this time, it wasn't loneliness he felt, it was peace. He gently touched the petals of one of the oldest roses, planted 23 years ago. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for Emma Clare. Thank you for giving me a purpose when I needed it most. Thank you for being the woman you were, for making the sacrifices you made. And thank you for somehow giving me a family even after you were gone." The wind blew softly, moving the roses in a delicate dance. And Richard smiled, choosing to believe it was Martha's way of saying it was all right, that she was proud, that her love still echoed through the years. He returned to his small room, no longer a place of solitude, but a refuge where he processed the day, where he kept his most precious memories. On his nightstand, there was now not only the old photo of Martha, but also photos of Emma Clare, of the twins, of the whole family together. Before sleeping, he picked up the journal he had started writing years ago, right after Martha left. For a long time, the entries were dark, full of pain and loss. But in the last 5 years, they had changed. Now they were about small joys, about connections made, about a family that had been built from the shards of several broken lives. He wrote that night's entry. Today was my 57th birthday. Unlike the one 5 years ago when Catherine found me alone in the garden with a small cake, today I was surrounded by family. Emma Claire made chocolate cake my favorite, which she somehow found out without me ever telling her. The twins sang happy birthday completely off-key but adorably. Catherine and Julia joked about me getting old. And I realized something important. I'm no longer living in the shadow of loss. I'm living in the light of everything Martha gave me, including people and connections I never would have imagined. She transformed my life twice, first when we met, and second when her story was finally revealed. Martha, wherever you are, I hope you know that your daughter is extraordinary. She has your kindness, your strength, your huge heart. And our grandchildren, well, you would be amazed by them. Thank you for everything. I love you always. Richard closed the journal and turned off the light. Outside, the garden slept under the moonlight, the white roses luminous in the darkness. And somewhere between sleep and wakefulness, Richard dreamed. He dreamed of Martha young and healthy, laughing in that way of hers that lit up everything. And in the dream, she held 2 babies, twins, and said, "Look what we created, Richard. Look at the beauty that came from our love." He woke with the sun rising, a smile still on his face. It was a new day, full of possibilities, and he was not alone. In the weeks that followed that birthday, subtle but significant changes continued to happen. Emma Claire announced she was pregnant again, not with twins this time, but with a girl. She and her husband decided to name her Martha Catherine, honoring both the biological mother and the aunt who had become a maternal figure in her life. Martha Catherine, Richard repeated when he heard the name, tears in his eyes. It's perfect. We wanted a part of both of you to live on, Emma Claire explained. And we wanted the new generation to know these stories, to understand where they come from. Catherine was equally moved, feeling that her sister was being honored in a way she never would have expected. She began writing Martha's story, documenting everything they had discovered, all the memories Richard had shared. It was meant to be a gift for the future Martha Catherine, so that when she grew up, she could know the grandmother and great-aunt who inspired her name. Julia also had news. She had met someone, a doctor, who worked with special needs children and shared her passion for social justice. It was a new relationship, but there was a seriousness to it that made Catherine hopeful that perhaps finally Julia would find the happiness she deserved. "He's good for you," Catherine told her daughter one day. "I can see that." "He reminds me of Dad in some ways," Julia admitted. "Not physically, but in the way he cares, how he wants to make a difference in the world." "Charles would be happy," Catherine replied. "He always wanted you to find someone who understood you." The garden remained the heart of everything. Richard had expanded the White Roses bed, creating a more formal memorial space where visitors from Emma Claire's school could come and reflect. He placed a discreet plaque that simply said, "In memory of Martha, who taught that love is sacrifice and that beauty can grow even from the most difficult experiences." People began coming from far away to see the garden, drawn by the stories Emma Claire shared in her writings. Richard, initially uncomfortable with the attention, eventually accepted the role of guardian of that special space. He gave tours, told stories about the different plants, and always ended at the White Roses, sharing the love story they represented. "People need hope," Catherine told him when he expressed doubts about all the attention. "And your story with Martha, our story as a family, offers that. It shows that even from the most painful losses, something beautiful can grow." Richard agreed, though he still struggled sometimes with the vulnerability that came from sharing something so personal. But he saw the impact it had. He saw families dealing with their own losses find solace in the garden. He saw people who had been adopted find hope in Emma Claire's story. One particularly touching visitor was an elderly lady who showed up one day, leaning on a cane, asking for Richard. "Were you Martha's husband?" she asked in a trembling voice. "Yes, I was," Richard replied. "I was a nurse at the institution where she lived," the lady explained. "I retired many years ago, but recently I read about this place, about Martha's story. I needed to come. I needed to say, she talked about you a lot. Even on the hard days when she was in pain or confused, your name brought her peace." Richard felt the tears come. "She was everything to me," he said simply. "I know," the nurse replied, "and I want you to know that she was happy. In her circumstances, she found joy. Much of that was you." That conversation stayed with Richard for days, weeks. It was a reminder that despite all the suffering Martha went through, despite all the things that were denied to her, she had been happy. She had loved and been loved. And in the end, perhaps that was all that truly mattered. As autumn arrived, bringing golden colors and fresh air, the family began preparations for the birth of Martha Catherine. Emma Clare, now 6 months pregnant, spent more time at the mansion wanting to be close to family during this important period. "I want her to be born here," Emma Clare announced one day. "Not necessarily in the mansion, but in New York City. Close to you. Close to my mother's roses." Catherine was thrilled with the idea, already transforming one of the guest rooms into a space for Emma Clare and her family to stay. Julia helped with the legal and medical preparations, ensuring everything was perfect for the baby's arrival. Richard quietly began working on something special. He took cuttings from the oldest roses, those first ones he had planted for Martha, and began the delicate process of propagating them. His plan was to give Emma Clare a seedling to plant wherever she wanted, literally carrying a piece of Martha with her. When he told Catherine about the plan, she hugged him tightly. "You have such a good heart," she said. "Martha was very lucky to have you." "I was the lucky one to have her," Richard corrected. The propagation process took months, requiring patience and care. But when the seedlings finally rooted and began showing signs of new life, Richard felt deep satisfaction. It was as if a cycle was completing, Martha literally being passed to the next generation. Emma Clare gave birth to Martha Catherine on a cold December morning just before Christmas. It was a peaceful delivery, without complications, and when Richard saw his granddaughter for the first time, he felt as if he were looking at Martha again. The baby had the same expressive eyes, the same delicate mouth. "She's perfect," he whispered, holding the baby with extreme care. "She is," Emma Clare agreed, exhausted but radiant. "She's the continuation of everything Mommy started." When they brought baby Martha Catherine home to the mansion a few days later, Richard had prepared the garden. The roses were decorated with white ribbons, and in the center of the memorial bed he had planted a new special rose that would bloom next summer. "This is for you, little Martha," he told the baby, though she was sleeping. "So you'll always know you have roots here, that you're part of something bigger." The first Christmas together as a complete family was magical. The mansion, which had been quiet and empty for so many years, was now full of laughter, conversation, and love. The twins ran through the hallways, baby Martha Catherine was passed from lap to lap, and everyone gathered around the tree that Catherine had insisted on decorating personally. "A toast," Julia raised her wineglass. "To Dad, who left us with one final gift in the form of this family. To Aunt Martha, who even without having met most of us, brought us together. To Richard, who guards these memories and keeps this garden alive. And to all of us, who found each other in unexpected ways. To love," Catherine added. "To love that transcends death, that unites families, that creates beauty even from suffering." "To love," everyone repeated, including the twins who barely understood the meaning but enjoyed participating. Richard looked around the table, seeing all those people who were now part of his life. Emma Clare with her family, Catherine who had become much more than an employer, Julia who treated him with genuine affection, and the little ones who called him Grandpa. "Martha," he said silently, a thought for her wherever she might be, "look what you created. Look at the family that grew from our love. You made everything worthwhile." That night, after everyone had gone to sleep, Richard returned to the garden one last time. It was cold, the stars shining intensely in the clear sky. He approached the roses, touching the dry stems that slept until spring. "Thank you," he said aloud this time. Thank you for giving me Emma Claire even though it cost your life. Thank you for those years we had together. Thank you for this garden, this family, this life I never would have imagined possible. I still miss you every day, Martha. It still hurts sometimes, that space where you should be. But it's not an empty pain anymore. It's a pain full of gratitude, full of beautiful memories, full of love that keeps growing. The wind blew, moving the dry branches of the rose bushes. And Richard smiled, choosing to believe it was Martha, responding, saying everything was fine, that she was also happy with how things had unfolded. In the months that followed, the family routine settled into a new rhythm. Emma Claire and her family moved permanently to New York City, buying a house near the mansion. The twins often visited Grandpa in the garden, helping him water plants and learning the names of the flowers. Martha Catherine grew quickly and healthily, her smile lighting up any room. Catherine became a constant presence in the baby's life, a grandmother aunt who offered wisdom, love, and infinite patience. Emma Claire's school continued to prosper. She implemented a therapeutic gardening program, bringing Richard on as a consultant. Together, they created green spaces in various institutions, always planting white roses as a symbol of hope and continuity. It was during one of these projects that Richard received a call that changed his perspective once again. It was from a foundation that offered awards to people who made a significant difference in their communities. Someone had nominated Richard, and he was being considered for a special recognition. "I haven't done anything special," he protested when Catherine told him. "I just tended a garden and loved my wife." "You've done much more than that," Catherine corrected. "You kept Martha's memory alive. You built a family when you could have stayed alone. You use your pain to help others. That is special, Richard." He ended up accepting the nomination, more to not disappoint Emma Claire and Catherine than from any desire for recognition. The ceremony would be in March, right around the time the roses would begin to bloom again. As winter gave way to spring, Richard began preparations to plant the 30th white rose for Martha. But this time, there was something different. Emma Claire suggested that instead of just the family planting it, they hold a small event, inviting people whose lives had been touched by Martha's story. It would be a way to show that her love reached far beyond what she herself knew, Emma Claire explained. Richard agreed, though nervous about the idea of sharing such a personal moment with others. But when the day came, and he saw the small crowd gathered in the garden, he understood why it was important. There were families who had been helped by Emma Claire's school. There were people from the old institution where Martha had lived. There were neighbors who had watched the mansion transform from a place of mourning to a place of life. And there were strangers who had read the story and traveled to witness that moment. Emma Claire spoke first, telling Martha's story from the perspective of a daughter who never knew her but carried her legacy. Catherine spoke about discovering a sister she never knew she had, about how that revelation changed her understanding of family and love. Julia spoke about how the story had inspired her work, and then it was Richard's turn. He stood up, holding the 30th white rose, looking at all those people gathered in honor of Martha. "Martha and I had only 9 years together," he began, his voice choked with emotion. 9 years that felt like both an eternity and the blink of an eye. She left too young, with dreams unfulfilled, with a life that should have been longer and fairer. But in those 9 years she taught me more about love, courage and sacrifice than many people learn in an entire lifetime. When I plant these roses, it's not just to remember her death, it's to celebrate her life. Each rose is a year of memory, a year of gratitude, a year of love that keeps growing even after she's no longer physically here." He knelt, digging the hole in the familiar soil, and then invited Emma Claire and Catherine to join him. Together, the three planted the 30th white rose, their hands touching in the earth where Martha's ashes had been scattered over the years. "For Martha," Richard said, his voice steady now, "who taught us that love doesn't end with death, that family isn't just blood, that beauty can grow even from the greatest suffering. Thank you for everything you were, everything you gave us, and everything you continue to be through us." The silent crowd watched as they watered the new rose, a sacred moment of remembrance and honor. And then, spontaneously, someone began to sing, a simple song, a lullaby that Martha used to sing to the children at the institution. Others joined in, and soon the garden was filled with voices united in memory of a woman most had never met, but whose impact everyone felt. Richard closed his eyes, letting the song wash over him, and for the first time since Martha left, he felt true peace, not the absence of pain, but the acceptance of it, the understanding that pain was just another form of love, that carrying grief was a privilege because it meant he had something valuable to lose. When the song ended, the crowd slowly dispersed, each person stopping to touch the rose petals, to whisper their own prayers or thoughts. Richard, Catherine, Emma Claire and Julia stayed, along with the little ones playing carefree nearby. "We did well," Catherine said softly. "Charles would be proud. Martha would be proud." "Yes," Richard agreed. "I think they would be." A few months later, at the awards ceremony, Richard stood on stage accepting recognition for his contribution to the community through therapeutic gardening and his work with special people. Emma Claire was in the audience with the whole family, applauding and crying with pride. In his acceptance speech, Richard spoke simply, "This award isn't mine, it's Martha's, who taught me to see beauty and value in places where others didn't. It's my daughter, Emma Claire's, who transformed her own painful story into a force for good. It's Catherine and Julia Williams who opened their lives and their home to include someone from the outside. And it's Charles Williams who kept heavy secrets to protect those he loved. We are all part of this story, and any good that comes from it is the result of love that refuses to die." The audience rose in applause, and Richard saw his family standing, clapping louder than anyone. And he thought not for the first time how strange and wonderful life was. How that lonely birthday with a small cake 5 years ago had led to this, all this wealth of connection and love. That night, driving home, Catherine at the wheel with Richard in the passenger seat, they drove in comfortable silence for a while. "Are you happy?" Catherine finally asked. Richard thought carefully before answering. "I carry grief for Martha every day," he said. "I always will. But yes, I am happy. I have a wonderful daughter, grandchildren who fill me with joy, a family that accepts me completely. I have a purpose, a garden to care for, memories to honor. So yes, within the longing, within the pain that never completely goes away, I am happy." "Well," Catherine said with a smile, "then Martha is happy too. Wherever she is, she's smiling, knowing you've moved forward without forgetting her." "It's a delicate balance," Richard admitted. "Living in the present while honoring the past. But I think I've finally learned how to do it." When they arrived back at the mansion, it was late at night, but Richard did what he always did before bed, walked to the garden to check the roses. The 30th rose was adapting well, its green buds promising future flowers. He sat on the familiar bench, the same one where Catherine had found him 5 years earlier, and looked at the night sky. The stars shone, infinite and eternal, reminding him that he was just a small part of something much greater. "I'm still here," he said aloud, speaking to Martha as he used to do, "still taking care of your garden, still loving you, still trying to make you proud. Our Emma Claire is doing so well, Martha. She has your heart, your strength, and our grandchildren. Oh, you would love our grandchildren. They have your light, your pure joy. You live through them, you know. Every time Peter laughs, I hear you. Every time Martha Catherine smiles, I see you. You haven't completely left. You've just changed form, transformed into love that blooms in many hearts." A light turned on in the house, probably Emma Claire or Catherine getting up for some reason. Richard saw the silhouette pass by the window and smiled. His family, awake even late at night, always close. He rose from the bench, his back reminding him that he was 58 now, no longer the 29-year-old who had met Martha. But age was just a number. What mattered was the love he carried, the memories he kept alive, the family he had helped build. Before returning to his small room, he did one last thing. He took his pruning shears and carefully cut a white rose from the oldest rose bush. He took it with him, placing it in a small vase next to Martha's photo on his bedside table. "Good night, my love," he whispered to the photo. "Until tomorrow." And for the first time in 28 years, when he lay down to sleep, Richard didn't dream of loss. He dreamed of a vast garden, full of white roses, and Martha was there, healthy and smiling, saying, "You did well, Richard. You did very well." End of story. And you? What did you think of this story of love, loss, and reunion? Do you think love can truly continue beyond death, transforming into legacy and family? Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what you felt hearing Richard and Martha's journey. Don't forget to leave your like, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other emotional stories we've prepared for you. Your companionship means everything to us,